Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and I'm so thrilled today to be joined by Jin Ha to talk all about Apple TV Plus's Pachinko. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the work that you did so extensively with your dialect coach, Yumi Kang, because I'm so fascinated by the extensiveness of that process, the fact that it was over several months, and it sounds like it was a journey of deconstructing the scripts within Korean before translating them to Japanese and then translating them to English. And was so interested in how the two of you really figured out what the most conducive process to really mastering this character, mastering this role, and all the different kind of dialects that came with that for your performance.
I think this is the appropriate forum for me to actually dive into the nitty gritty of that.
Yeah.
Because you already touched on so many of the pieces of it. So Yumi Kang, as you cited, she essentially, I don't think Solomon Beck would have existed without Yumi Kang, truly. She is a unicorn of a dialect coach and almost acting coach as well for me, because of us having to craft the performance in the Japanese language, in addition to learning the language, in and of itself. The process was incredibly complex and detailed, as you mentioned. It would start with Sue Hugh, our showrunner and creator, having written the script in English, and then she would have that translated by a team into Japanese and Korean, which would then be back translated by another team of translators back to English, so that she could then give notes on how she felt about the translation, whether she felt, this is an appropriate cultural translation that was needed, or I would like this to be closer to what my original meaning was, et cetera, et cetera. From that, Yumi and I would receive the Japanese and Korean scripts. The Korean, for us, because I speak Korean, we were able to talk about and break down and work on just the Japanese dialect that I would have as Solomon, because Solomon is born and raised in Japan. He learned Korean at home and maybe a little bit at school, we surmised, but it would still be heavily influenced by Japanese language. And so I actually used Yumi's natural Japanese accent in her Korean as a plate, so to speak, for Solomon's Korean as well. And then within Japanese, Yumi would have received the Japanese scripts. She would then transliterate the Japanese text into Korean letters phonetically. I would then receive that, and then she would also, break down the definitions as well of the lines, and in Korean. And then I would transliterate the Korean text into Roman letters and English phonetics, so that I could better read it and memorize it. And then this next step was also, because Yumi happens to be an actor herself, we were able to do scene analysis, essentially, break down the text and have conversations with each other about, okay, this is the emotional place that I'm coming from when I enter the scene. Here's my objective. Here are the obstacles that I feel like Solomon is facing in this moment. If these were the circumstances for you, how would you imagine you delivering this line? Because even though Japanese is not a tonal language like Mandarin, say, there are, just like English, very natural ways, musicalities of sentences that, if slightly different, will stick out to someone who speaks the language fluently as perhaps slightly off, or something feels unfamiliar in that way. Like even the way that in English, whether we go down on a sentence or we go up on a sentence, or what operative words do we stress and emphasize, that makes the biggest difference when I am trying to achieve the perception of full fluency. Do you know what I mean? There's a big gap between sounding language and trying to pass as fluent. And a lot of our work was taking the lines and the work with a microscope and trying to fine tune exactly where is my pitch variety, which words do I emphasize in this, where can I pace what could be, as somebody's thinking, and thinking and speaking at the same time as we all do, there's different pacing to how I speak. Even how I'm speaking my sentences now sometimes I speak quite rapidly through part of it, and then I'll stop at some point. And we were doing a lot of work of trying to find options which sounded natural in both the Osaka and Kanto dialects, which is the Tokyo dialect. Because Solomon, we decided, was born and raised in Osaka and spoke an Osaka dialect with family and close friends like Hana, but then had worked in Tokyo as well, and had learned that standard dialect as well. And so it was like truly the most detailed and microscopic, like the minutia that we were focusing on was truly remarkable. And it felt like I was in some sort of linguistics doctorate program, trying to break down and understand like every different turn and facet of the Japanese languages as best as I could. That was such a long-winded answer.
No, but I'm absolutely fascinated by these details. And especially when you're talking about the tonality and the rhythm and the pacing of the dialogue, because obviously that pertains to language, but that also pertains to character, and particularly with Solomon, because I know you've talked about him as a character who code switches. Who he is in the office, how he talks to people there is very different to how he talks to his grandmother, how he talks to family, how he talks to the landowner when he's trying to kind of build a connection with her as well. And so there's that added layer as well on top of everything that you were just talking about. And so how did you take it that next level and find the nuances of how is it that he's speaking? What's the difference in terms of pacing, depending on which characters he's interacting with and which setting he's in as well?
That's it. That is the question. That is the challenge of the entire shoot, was that everything I have just explained up until this point was just the first couple of steps to getting to a final performance that we're seeing on the screen. Something else that I forgot to mention too was we created a shorthand. Maybe we can patent this if we keep working on it, but we created a shorthand of annotation on the paper to denote like, oh, this is when I could take a breath if I wanted to. This is when I would use lines to denote pitches of sentences. So, if a sentence was written like this, then I'd say, well, it starts about in the mid-range of my voice, and then in this word or in this syllable of the word, it kicks up and then immediately goes down like that. It was like literally that sort of amount of detail that we had broken down every single line of text of mine in that manner. The next step was me trying to memorize it so deeply that I could forget the text, right? That's a goal, I think, most of the time when I'm working on a role, but specifically, especially for this task, to try to act on top of all of this technical work that I'm juggling in my mind was on paper seemingly an impossible task. And it was day to day for me. Some days I'd feel really confident about the scenes that I'm coming into, and then other days it'd be a 5-minute scene in all Japanese, mostly with Naomi's character, with Naomi. And those were the days that Yumi and I knew from day one. It was like, well, we're going to have to work the hardest on those scenes to prepare, to have all of those monologues so second nature in my mouth and my body that I could then be present on the day and actually be listening and receiving and breathing together with my scene partners in telling the story, right? Because the hardest part is the work is an incredibly difficult part of it. But in my opinion, the hardest part is letting go of that work, is getting to a place of ease where, in theater, often the idea is to always be more, possibly forget one's lines so that it feels alive in the moment, as opposed to this is the 7th time I've done it this week. It felt like a similar process for me with this role. Even though it was TV, I needed to have established that amount of comfort and familiarity with the text and all of the subtext and the thoughts that we've mapped out within each scene So much so that by the time I'm on set and with my scene partners in my costume, with my props for the first time, I cannot, I won't be thinking about the text work at all. Do you know what I mean? The hope is by that point, that's the last thing I'm thinking about, because at that moment, I want to be here and not here. And that's to be determined, I suppose. How you know, how's it looking?
It looks pretty great from the episodes I've seen so far in the show.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the other spaces as well where it pulls in that idea of doing the work beforehand so that you can let it go, but kind of finding how it influences character is also the extensive research that you did, because in a show like this that's telling multi-generational stories, it's not just about who Solomon is in his storyline, but it's, you know, his family lineage, their history, their experience. And there's that really interesting exploration in him of what are the parts of him that exist because of his family's experiences, because of choices that they've made in their lives and their journeys. And then what are the ways in which he's really trying to forge his own path. And I know that there was extensive research that went into a lot of that as well, even to the degree of, okay, well, what would have been happening in Japan when his dad was this age? And so every day was just kind of building even more and more of a backstory, in addition to everything that the scripts gave you, in addition to everything that the book gave you. And so what was that part of the journey of a lot of the historical factual information that you were looking up, and how that really helped you to shape the two dynamics of Solomon as a character with his history informing him?
The blessing that comes with preparing and performing a character like Solomon is that so much of the work in terms of research has already been done for me. Not in terms of, I mean, I had hours and hours of just reading articles and essays and excerpts of textbooks throughout the months of research. And also a lot of YouTube videos, actually, which are incredible resources in terms of having access to what is it, like primary resources, like video footage, maybe from obviously 70s, 80s, 90s. The music, for me, I always start with music with any job that I have. It's always my jumping off point of like, what was the music that Solomon would have been listening to, not just as a young adult, when he was growing up, going to school, boarding high school in Connecticut and studying at, was it Yale? I think, yeah, Yale, in our show. What's the music of the 80s then? And then further back, what's the music that he would have heard growing up in the household that his parents or his grandparents listened to, and sort of served as the background, the backdrop of his youth, or walking down the street? What would be the sort of ads that would be playing, on the window, what do you call it, the shop windows? And I sort of, for me, it's always following just threads of curiosity. And what I mean by half of the work was done for me is that Min Jin Lee's book itself is so incredibly well and deeply researched and rooted in historical fact, but on top of that, first-person interviews of women who were of Sanja's generation and experience. There was the book that's at the very beginning that I believe it's Jackie. It might be Jackie Lee. I can't remember, but it's called the book is called Hidden Treasures, and it's a series of interviews that this Japanese Korean writer recorded and transcribed with older women of the Zainichi generation, of her parents and grandparents' generation. And it's clear reading through those interviews how much Min Jin Lee pulled from those stories directly in crafting this incredibly intricate history and legacy of Sanja's family, of Sanja and her family. And those were incredibly useful as jumping off points for me of, oh, I see, this was mentioned in this part of their history. It's sort of like Forrest Gump, where it's like this family experienced this part of that history that I had learned of from undergrad years ago. Let me go revisit that subject and just follow, go through the search engine, rabbit holes of like, well, this relates to this event that happened in world economics in like 1988. Well, actually that bust in 1989 was a lead up from like the boom that was happening, for several years. And it just goes on and on and on for weeks. And for weeks before and through our shooting, my laptop was, my browser was almost always had about 20 plus tabs that are open for me that I'm like, I will eventually get to reading these articles or these essays. I love that part for me. That's such a joy for me as an actor to have a reason, or rather, my job as an actor is to learn as much as I can about a new subject with every job, most of the time. And with this job, Pachinko, was certainly the most material that I had to research and cover in terms of what would have been second nature to Solomon, right? Like for us growing up, the events of our lives, we know so much about because we've lived through them. And we all talked about it at the time. We talked about it afterwards. We reflected on it. There are shifts in culture because of those moments in our lifetime. And so similarly, for me, it was like, what would be the main events of Solomon's youth and lifetime, not just personally, but that events that are happening around the world and in Japan and in New York that would have influenced him and how he sees the world. That was the line of questioning that I followed in a lot of my research with him. And then a lot of it was just personal reflection, right? Because it's so much of his experience as a Zainichi immigrant, not just in Japan, but also in America. Those experiences for me in terms of trying to assimilate and trying to fit in a space where clearly he does not in so many ways. I'm familiar with that myself as an Asian American, having come here when I was 8. So it was a lot of outside in and inside out work for Solomon. I don't think I've had the privilege of working on a role that was so deeply personal for me.
And in speaking a little bit more about the scenes where it's Solomon and Sunja, what's beautiful about those scenes is the way that Solomon really gives her the space to tell her stories, to have those moments of reflection. And so because you were bringing up the idea before of just that necessary presence that you have to have in active listening, did you find that in those scenes in particular, there was even more of an opportunity to do that and to kind of show up as a scene partner in that way? Because it's not about Solomon being the first person to say something in those rooms and spaces. It's about him sitting back and listening and giving other people space.
That's interesting. I didn't feel a difference in terms of the element of active listening with my grandmother, with Sunja or with YJ. It wasn't different from any other scene. I felt like, generally speaking, because of the elements of the Korean and Japanese languages, I was actively listening every single time because I needed to. From a practical sense, for my cue lines, I just wanted to make sure I was catching the cue line so that I could respond in time. But in addition to that, it's also because the languages are not, neither Korean nor Japanese are my first language. I guess Korean is kind of my first language, but English is I'm most fluent in English. And because of that, I had to be so much more attentive. I mean, I perhaps I always am because that's my goal. But when I don't speak the language that people are speaking to me and I have to act with them, I will listen very hard. I will be listening very hard because I want to be the best scene partner that I can for my castmates, but also I don't want to be made to look like a fool. Do you know what I mean? It's also like, anyway, I'm digressing. What was your YJ? Yes, but specifically separate from that, working with YJ was a dream, right? She is a living legend. And for me to be able to have gotten to know her and we've become quite good friends because we get along quite well. I think we have very similar temperaments, which work beautifully for our scenes, because very quickly there was, funnily enough, a sense of camaraderie between us. And we also share the same birthday, we found out. A couple of years apart, but it was same birthday. And for me, I was actively listening to YJ because I wanted to learn from her. Whenever I had an opportunity, whenever we had scenes together, for me, in my mind, I was always being present and trying to be as helpful and honest of a scene partner as possible. But in the back of my mind, I'm also observing and being like, okay, what is she doing? Like, oh, I see. How is she preparing for? Oh, wow, she just dropped right into that, didn't she? Okay, well, there's so much ease there. You know, it's like this. For me, I felt like the scene where I got to watch the landlady and my grandmother speaking at the dinner table. For me, that was a masterclass all day. I had the honor of just sitting at that table watching these two brilliant actors at work. And my job was to eat food and occasionally check in with my grandmother. But truly, that was one of my most unforgettable days on set, because I felt like I was in rarefied air, and I was worried that I was like, I'm going to forget my lines because I'm just watching them perform in front of me. It was, yeah, a really, it's incredibly inspiring for me to be surrounded by so many incredible Korean actors as examples to look up to, as, oh, I see, there is also a level of craft that I can always strive for. And I have people who look like me who are setting these examples.
That's
and I
amazing.
get to work with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And eat food and listen.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, also talking a little bit about some of the trajectory for Solomon as a character, you know, there obviously was that great moment and that shift for him when so much had been about him being driven by his career, when he sits there and actually encourages the landowner not to take the deal. And in particular, I wanted to talk about the scene that comes after, where he's outside in the rain dancing, because it was such a beautiful scene and it felt very much like a character kind of coming back to his roots, a lot of things that are coming to the surface for him. And then kind of in the scenes in the episodes following, it's great to watch your performance, because there's this kind of deconstruction in the way that he is becoming even more self-reflective as a character as well. And what are the implications of this decision that I made? Because essentially I just blew everything up.
Yeah.
And so what's been the joy of that exploration for you with him as a character, being able to have a scene like that moment right after in the rain with the music, and then to really look at the ramifications and what that means for him as a character and how that influences your performance following?
That's really, yeah. It's interesting because you're speaking to the progression and the arc of the character as told through the show. And I'm thinking back on the way we shot it, and that was, you know, most of the time is out of sync. And so that day, I'm completely following you on the trajectory that you're pointing to, the sort of like the fulcrum point where it sort of seesawed into before and after that conference meeting for Solomon. That day in the rain, dancing in the rain and running, was actually my first day of shooting entirely. And it was the first day of shooting in Korea. And it was really fascinating to have that be the kickoff to my experience on the production, because, you know, I did one short scene with maybe 1 or 2 lines earlier in the day, but most of my day was no lines, just me sprinting downstairs, across courtyards, upstairs, like truly hours and hours of me sprinting as fast as I could, which was so liberating for me as an actor who tends to be incredibly cerebral. I loved that my first introduction to meeting Solomon on set was just running for his life, truly. Legs were jelly by the end of the day. And then by 2 a.m., I think that's when we started shooting the dance sequence with the band in the subway, and the rain was maybe about 3 a.m. So it was beautifully structured that by the time we were meeting Solomon in this moment of full release and just letting go of all the masks and the weights that he's been juggling, was also when I, the actor, was letting go and fully releasing into my utter exhaustion of having just spent the entire day sprinting around in a suit. And then to begin my work with Solomon after that was, I don't think it was planned, but it was such a beautiful coincidence to quite literally take myself out of my head, right? The character had been so rooted in this technical work of the language and the history and the research, and his work in finance as well, what that entails. And yet I'm meeting Solomon. Jin is meeting Solomon at this point of explosion, of chaos. And then to sort of put the pieces back together as we continue to shoot was a really exciting way for me to get to know a character. I'm trying to remember now the other part of your question that you had, because it was great. Something about, could you remind me something about the
essentially how like that arc allows you to look at like the deconstruction of a character with everything that then comes to the surface for him.
I mean, I'm just grateful. Frankly, I'm just grateful that you picked up on that arc, because that was our hope, right? That there would be a Solomon before, and then there's that life-changing moment for him, and then the catalyst, and then Solomon after. And we tried to keep that in mind, right? For me, it was personally like, it's hard to tell how much of it reads from my perspective, but the hope is I can prepare the work as carefully and as specifically as I can, and trust that it will come through to an audience. But there were a lot of even superficial details that I remember trying to keep in mind of how does he carry his face? I'm really interested in micro gestures, sometimes too much, but I'm fascinated, especially in the screen medium, the film and TV medium, of the stories and the thoughts and feelings that can be communicated to an audience with the slightest of movements. Not that one needs to be stilted or stiff. It can't be at all. It needs to be incredibly natural. But there are ways to, it's just fascinating for me. It's a never-ending study and an investigation for me of how we communicate non-verbally. How do we understand what subtext is? We all understand subtext. How? What are the calculations that our brain is subconsciously doing and making to receive or interpret or process how somebody outside of us might be feeling or thinking without having expressed anything explicitly? So similarly for me, a lot of the breaking down of Solomon's character was, who is he when he speaks English? Like you mentioned, like the languages are a huge part, because how we communicate, how we literally speak affects how we hold our faces, how we hold our lips, where we speak from in our throats. All of these details that I had studied from singing, I applied just to speaking as well. And then for me, I remember thinking when Solomon is speaking English, especially the context in which he's speaking English, which is almost always in the context of work, of business, of like New York finance, so to speak. I wanted that to feel the most held. I wanted that to feel the thickest of masks. And that was in my mind, literally translating it to like, does he have a bit of more of a smirk in those moments versus when he's at home in his childhood home with his family speaking Japanese or Korean? Is there a physical way that I can manifest his comfort and his familiarity with that space versus when we find him in Shifley's? I don't know if it worked, but those were the things that I was thinking about. Those are the things that I worked on with Yumi, with our directors, with Sue, certainly. It was that amount of detail that we went into for the prep. And I'm just one of, a dozen characters that we have, series regulars that we have on the show that we follow, who, in my opinion, are all doing extraordinarily nuanced and stunning work as well.
Yeah. I mean, the technicality of everything that you had to do for this role is so impressive, but it's also such a great emotionally connected character and performance. And I'm so impressed with everything that you've done with the show so far. Can't wait to watch the last couple of episodes. Thank you so much, Jin.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a pleasure. I hope you got some out of all that.